Great, thank you. Thank you so much, Jess, and all of the others for having me. It's really a pleasure to be here. Unfortunately, not in Stockholm. That would be nice, but I'm so glad that there are so many of you also in the audience from all over. So good afternoon, good morning, good evening, whatever time it is. Very pleased to meet all of you. Yeah, so I'm really excited to have the opportunity to talk about a program that we developed in Berlin. And maybe this is a bit unusual for a methods lecture series, but I promise I'll bring in the relevance here. It's called Peerspectives, our program, and I'm going to share some perspectives from Peerspectives, specifically on how we've tried to use this course as a tool to improve the quality of peer review reports and to strengthen methods competencies. And I'll also present some results from preliminary results from our scientific evaluation of the course. So just briefly about me, I am an epidemiologist, and as Jess mentioned, I recently switched jobs actually just a few days ago. So for those of you who know the academic job shuffle, that's where I'm at right now, but I still have an affiliation with the Charite, and this work was done with colleagues mostly at the Institute of Public Health. So just briefly to my conflicts of interest, we did receive some funding for this program from what's called a Spokes Wellcome Trust funded Translational Partnership Fellowship. Quite a mouthful. That was via the Quest Center of the Berlin Institute of Health. Actually, I'll talk a bit more about that later in the talk. I also myself serve as a peer reviewer for various scientific journals, including the BMJ, which partners with Peerspectives. And outside of this work, I've received a research grant from Novartis Pharma for a self-initiated project on migraine. And of course, I'm very passionate about improving peer review and training doctoral students. Otherwise, I probably wouldn't be talking to you about this today. So whether we like it or not, science depends on peer reviewers. So we've outsourced, let's say, a good amount of quality control at journals, and in science, we've entrusted it, maybe is the better word to use, to peer reviewers. And peer review, whether we like it or not, as I said, is a central pillar in scientific publishing. And I think as a testament, a lot of us get these kind of emails every single day in our inboxes. And peer review actually has a long history in methods research and actually also in medicine. Here's a philosopher, theologian, and diplomat, you could say, Heinrich Oldenburg, a German guy who was the secretary to the Royal Society. And he's actually credited with the practice of sending submitted manuscripts to experts who could judge their quality before publication. So he thought that this was a good idea. And already in 1665, this was considered to be the beginning of both the concept of peer review and actually the first scientific journal. So why would someone do peer review? For those of you who have done peer review before, I'm sure some people here have never conducted peer review themselves. So I'll just highlight a few benefits of serving as a peer reviewer. You can stay up to date. You have an up-to-date overview of ongoing research in your field. You get to know about it before the world does, so to say. That can give you some important insights. You can exert an influence on improving the evidence body and the research methods that are used. You hopefully will be recognized in some way for your contribution, maybe by the editors of the journal. They'll start to recognize your name if you do good quality peer review. If the journal has open review where your name is published as a reviewer, maybe others will also recognize you for this contribution. The editors who get to know you maybe will ask you to write commentaries or editorials for their journal. Sometimes journals offer free subscriptions to their journal, special access to some journals, or even to cover part or all of the publication fees for open access, for example. So there are a few journal side incentives for peer reviewing. But one other main reason that I think peer review can be a useful task is that you can improve your own research and writing. If you understand how others write, if you read the comments of other peer reviewers, and also just more critically look at scientific manuscripts, that could also positively impact your own work. And of course, being a part of this larger system of scientific publishing, participating as a peer reviewer might help you better understand how that whole process works. So how manuscripts are evaluated and how that entire process works its way out. But of course, I wasn't born yesterday. Peer review is not without its problems. So I've said this is the pillar that we base a lot of our quality control in science on. I'm not saying that it's perfect. And indeed, peer review is often experienced by authors as a huge and sometimes insurmountable hurdle or burden. And I think anyone who's submitted a paper, if you're anything like me, you've experienced rejection more than once. It can really hurt. It can really be actually completely devastating, to be honest. And there's a lot of criticisms on that end of how the peer review system is not ideal or not without its problems. And perhaps during COVID-19, we really saw some key examples of this, this process that somehow doesn't even succeed in ensuring high quality sometimes, and that can be particularly frustrating. For example, perhaps you heard about this hydroxychloroquine paper, and you heard about the Lancet and the New England Journal sort of scandal, let's say, that resulted in them altering their editorial practices after this Surgisphere scandal. So what this taught us is that peer reviewers are not always effective in detecting issues and ensuring that published material is scientifically sound and of high quality. So that's another criticism, that sometimes the peer review process can also fail in this way. Not only do reviewers sometimes allow the bad stuff to get through, let's say, but sometimes they also make mistakes in the other direction. So perhaps some of you have heard, or maybe you'll find some comfort in the fact that even the big shots who went on to win Nobel Prizes for their contributions to science also experienced rejection. Sometimes I find this very reassuring. So Hans Krebs and the Krebs cycle, 1937, here you can see the rejection letter from Nature. I think they said that they already have received enough letters to fill the correspondence, so it's undesirable to accept further letters at the present time. So sorry, Hans Krebs, try your Krebs cycle, the citric acid cycle publication elsewhere, which eventually he managed and succeeded and got published. A few other examples, 1955, the invention of the radioimmunoassay was rejected from the Journal of Clinical Investigation, and Rosalind Yalow went on to win the Nobel Prize in Physiology and Medicine for that work in 1977. And in 1966, nuclear magnetic resonance spectroscopy, NMR spectroscopy, was rejected twice by the Journal of Chemical Physics. And Richard Ernst went on to get a Nobel Prize for his work. So sometimes, as I said, peer review fails in the sense that good quality science that's meaningful gets rejected and is passed by. And we may say, okay, but we're in epidemiology, this probably doesn't happen in our field, right? Well, I mean, there was this paper from a certain Jamie Robbins, the infamous, famous 1986 paper that had a hard time finding a home, found a home in this journal, Mathematical Modeling. I think it was originally submitted there in 1985, but published in 1986. Jamie Robbins then published an informal, accessible summary of his main results in 1987, but it really didn't find a home in an epi or a stats journal until 1992, so quite some delay there. Actually, that's a very interesting story, and I can only point people to this great article by Richardson and Rodzinski about the causal etiology of the research of Jamie Robbins. It's a very interesting story. So anyway, that's all to say that sometimes we get peer review wrong, peer review fails us, and there's a general desire to improve the process, but maybe we're not really sure how. My next question is whether or not peer review is a task for us scientists. So should we see peer review as part of our job descriptions? And what I've learned in developing the materials for this course is actually that some people have this explicitly listed in their job descriptions. I thought that was very interesting. Sometimes people have dedicated amounts of their time based on their university contract that they dedicate to peer review, but I think for the vast majority, that's not the case. And so peer review, we said it's a pillar, it's here to stay, at least for now. It's interesting to think about how much time you spend performing peer review. And I know many scientists are so fed up with the process that they say, well, actually, that's not me. I don't do it at all anymore. Okay, but then how much time do others spend reviewing your work? Because even if you decline all of your peer review requests, someone is reviewing your papers before they get published. So I really sometimes wonder how much these very prolific, high impact, highly cited folks also participate in the other side of this process. But of course, there are very limited incentives for doing so. And what we saw during COVID, as I mentioned earlier, you apply pressure to a system that's already under strain and is generally not able to cope with the sheer amount of scientific publications that are being submitted every single day, and you see quite an explosion. And this is what happened during COVID-19, and together with some colleagues, we authored this opinion piece where we saw this crush of the large influx of COVID-19 publication and how that really put a strain and actually broke, I would say, the capacity of the scientific publishing system. And I think we haven't fully seen a recovery there yet either. And it really is a delicate balance. So during the times of COVID, people were very focused on publishing and definitely not as focused on reviewing, even though the number of papers was continuously on the rise. As I said, I don't think we've really recovered from this fully yet. And the quality of review during this period majorly dropped. A lot of the big journals not only reported having a hard time finding reviewers, but having a hard time finding reviewers that could do a decent job. And of course, there was a lot of pressure on publishing good quality results and a lot of criticism there on the side of journals letting things through that shouldn't have gotten through as quickly or without more review. Here's a nice quote from Gary Collins on Twitter. Have we now ran out of peer reviewers? Just been invited to review a paper I'm an author on. Happened twice now in 2021. So there's really challenges in journals are having finding peer reviewers, and of course the more niche the field, the harder it is to find someone willing and able to review a certain paper. So posed with all of these problems, what can we do? I'm not here just to bring up all of the negative aspects, but also potentially pose some solutions. And the truth is, we don't really know what we can do to improve the quality of peer reviewers. Even though we're scientists and there are things like the Journal of Peer Review out there, the evidence base on this is very, very sparse. So maybe training helps, though there are a lot of published articles on the topic of training peer reviewers, a lot of just very heterogeneous programs and training modules that generally are not evaluated or not evaluated particularly well or rigorously. Hard to say if training works and in what format it works best. Maybe selecting reviewers more carefully could help, but how and who is selecting these reviewers? Do editors actually know how to select reviewers? Maybe giving reviewers feedback on their performance. So checking their peer review reports. But then the question would be, who does this? Is it the editors? Who gives them the feedback, and will they implement it? Maybe learning from or having supervision by other reviewers, but again, this is a time commitment, and finding the pair together, any kind of training activities takes some time. People generally don't have a lot of that these days. Maybe better incentives, giving people credit for their review activities, public acknowledgement, maybe within the university structures, incentivizing reviews, publishing the reviews as publications, potentially monetary incentives might be nice. Publons is one sort of solution where people can track their review activity. Maybe that's looked at in hiring committee decision making. Those are some things that have been posed, but generally not really acted upon so far. Some type of greater accountability, so moving more of the reviews into the open public sphere, giving researchers protected time to do peer review. So these are just some ideas. Having a more ongoing interaction between reviewers and authors. Some journals have already tried this, but it's quite limited, especially in epidemiology. I haven't really seen it. Some journals are doing a post-publication review or other variants of peer review where they essentially first publish and then review the manuscript. That's something eLife is trying out now. Maybe involving early career researchers. That's a big black box that we don't know a lot about because generally ECRs are not involved in peer review, or at least not in a structured way and not generally by journals. Maybe the automation of some of the tasks of a reviewer could help, but again, how and in what capacity and with what tools, and might they also be problematic? That's also really unknown at this point. And yeah, this concept of recognizing somehow or incentivizing review work as a valuable academic output. Okay, so our idea was to try to pick up on several of these points, addressing as many of these problems as we could, and create a program to train the health data scientists of the future. I call them health data science inclined doctoral students in peer review practice as the peer reviewers of tomorrow. And we wanted to provide a modern training and insights into the structure, purpose, and conduct of peer review and the editing processes. So what were we doing in this course that we developed? We wanted to explain the roles of scientific journals, editors, peer reviewers, and authors as parts of that scientific system, scientific process. So we figured, or we were convinced that first bringing early career researchers and doctoral students into this picture, once they are advanced postdocs or even further down the line is just too late, because they themselves are authoring papers, and it's only fair that they understand all of the players in the system and in the decision making. We also wanted to promote clear communication and efficiency in the review process, stimulate critical thinking and formulation of constructive scientific critique, which I would argue is a skill that people really need to practice before they can implement it well, and encourage transparency and adherence to ethical and methodological guidelines. So for those of you maybe who haven't taken a course or haven't done training on peer review, but maybe you've done peer review yourself, maybe you're not even aware that such a thing exists, like the COPE guidelines. So this is something that we teach in the class. We also wanted to introduce and explore concepts of open access, open science, and open review, which generally are of great interest to early career folks, but are maybe not incorporated in all of the traditional and high impact journals we see in our field. We also wanted to help them develop an understanding of what reviewers and editors are looking for. So as they're working on their own manuscript writing, maybe the first scientific manuscript to publish their first PhD papers, we wanted them to understand who will be assessing you. Essentially, what rubric are they using? What criteria are they using to help them improve their own writing, and hopefully then have more success with their own future submissions. And lastly, we wanted to have them explore real-world examples of study design and analysis strategies that you would encounter in a biomedical journal, for example, and identify some pros and cons in the applications. So taking what students have learned in their coursework, maybe they learned about a nested case control study, but wouldn't it be cool to see that in an actual application in a paper and take a close look at the methods in a very applied way? So we came up with the content of the course based on the scientific literature that existed on peer review practice and the scientific publishing landscape, commentaries and opinion pieces about peer review, a lot based on our personal experiences and discussions with many colleagues and experts, both who have, or all of them who've worked in peer review, editing, also from the journal side. who have both been around for a while, but are also involved in some of the newer initiatives. That was very important to us. We leaned pretty heavily on the BMJ reviewer training materials. So the BMJ was our journal partner in all of this thus far and has a lot of experience in training peer reviewers, not in a course like this, but they have quite nice reviewer training materials publicly available. And we also relied on the Science Editor's Handbook. And what we did was we developed a series of instructive lectures and mentor-guided small group workshops. I would say the second was more the feature of our course, and I'll talk about these elements in more detail in just a moment. And we wanted to provide the students with a hands-on experience in reviewing and understanding how the editing works of submitted research papers. And in doing all of this, it was important to us to make the student contributions count and give them credit for their work. So one thing we identified in the literature is that a lot of the peer review training that's out there, it's not very comprehensive, and it generally uses toy examples. And we said, you know, our students, they're really capable, they really understand methods, they really can give good feedback, and if they're going to be investing so much time and journals urgently need good peer review, why don't we couple those things together and make their outputs actually count for a journal and for the scientific world, right? So, and give them credit for doing that. So get them acknowledged, get them in the system, get them recognized by journal editors for their contribution so that they can also be engaged in high impact peer review, even at an early career stage. So we went about doing this. This was the roughly the structure of the course. We gave the students a pre-course assignment where they essentially do a peer review report as you would in the real world conditions. I'll come back to this more because this was also a part of the scientific evaluation study. After they did the pre-course assignment, then they went to 4 lectures that were held over Zoom with interaction and take-home assignments. Then they participated in 4 workshops that were led by an experienced editor mentor, and they worked collaboratively on preparing peer review reports for actual manuscripts from the BMJ, and then they completed a post-course assessment. And again, I'll come back to the assessments as part of the evaluation study. But first to the content of the lectures and the format. So the lectures were 3 hours each, and because this was all we managed to sneak our pilot in before the pandemic, but then the pandemic started, so the majority of our program was done entirely online. And that also had a big advantage in that it allowed us to include a lot more students and also international participants. With each round, we tried to recruit more and more broadly, and we also had the participation of international editor mentors, which was really great. So the lectures were done completely online, and we developed the material, as I mentioned, using the content from those different sources. We built in a lot of interactive polls to really engage the students. We had a lot of breakout room discussions and whole group discussions, and we gave them take-home assignments, which were quite extensive, and then would talk about that in the next session, that they could reflect on the assignments. And what we covered, here's just an overview, so I won't go into everything in detail. So as I mentioned, the role of all of those players in the scientific publishing system, we spend a lot of time on that. Actually, whose role is it, for example, to decide whether or not a paper gets accepted? Technically, this should be the role of the editor, but a lot of times the editors delegate this to the peer reviewers. Sometimes you even have to click a radio button in the peer review system to say that you recommend rejection of the paper or you recommend acceptance, but this is actually a decision that lies with the editor. So we debate and discuss a bit the role of those different players in the publishing system. Then we go through a history of peer review, how peer review is practiced, different types of review that are encountered in different journals, how it differs by field, because our students come from different adjacent fields, let's say to biomedicine and epidemiology, public health. So in each field they will encounter different types of peer review. We go through the criticism that's been levied against peer review in the way that it's conducted now. We talk about biases encountered in peer review. Of course, I can't get into all of these interesting topics today. We could be here for the whole evening, but this is something we spend a lot of time on in the class, and the limited evidence that's out there about peer review, we also try to summarize. Then we give them a lot of examples. So what does a good peer review report look like? What does a bad peer review report look like? Of course, these are subjective, but we try to bring in some examples and facilitate a discussion about what kind of comments would they like to get as authors, what kind of comments would they find helpful. And when we reached out into our networks, when we were developing the course, I can tell you we found a lot of bad examples people were willing to send us. So we have a lot of quotes that we work through with the students, and we try to identify, okay, what about this comment was offensive? Why was this comment problematic? How could you reframe this comment that it could actually be something constructive and useful? Then we have a dedicated section on sex and gender aspects in peer review. This is important to us, but also to many journals. So we have a dedicated section on this. We talk about the ethical guidelines from COPE, methodological reporting checklists, things like the Strobe checklist, Consort, Probast, that they understand to use one of these checklists depending on the study design type. We talk about open science, as I mentioned, these more modern or non-traditional review structures like the post-publication review that eLife is doing. And then in the final lecture, we spend time on an actual manuscript, again, submitted to the BMJ, where we walk them through how a review could be done, right? So someone doing a peer review, they get the article and they follow through step by step. How do you put together a peer review report for this article and some discussion? So it's a very, let's say, a tutorial. Of course, everyone does peer review differently. We're not there to be prescriptive and say there's only one way of doing this, but it's an example, and the students find this incredibly helpful to discuss actually the thought process behind how could you structure such a report. And then we go through really the whole process. So what can authors expect and what can reviewers expect from the time point that they submit the article to its final publication and beyond, and prepare them for the workshops. So I'll spend a bit of time talking about that because I think it's a nice feature. The workshops, there are 4 workshops that the students do following the lectures, and there's quite some preparation that goes into this. So both from the side of the participants, but also from the side of the coordination and the editor mentors who are running these groups. So how this works is we pair 1 editor mentor with 4 trainees in the course. So editor mentors are people, generally epidemiologists or biostatisticians we've recruited, or people from adjacent domains with those methods expertise who have at least some experience in editing with a journal. So it doesn't have to be with the BMJ. We've been quite broad in who we've recruited in that way, but they have some editing experience and, of course, substantial peer review experience themselves. So the trainees are paired with 1 editor mentor, and for each of the 4 workshops, they're assigned 1 real BMJ manuscript. So they receive the manuscript in advance, the 4 group members and the editor mentor. And actually, we transfer the material using this tool that we really like called PaperHive. This tool allows us to post PDFs and sort of works like Google Docs, where people can comment on the PDFs and exchange with each other on specific points. So already before meeting, the trainees read the paper and start to exchange on key elements of the paper, supplementary materials, things like that. They go through all of that. One of the trainees takes the lead for each manuscript, so they can kind of nudge the others if they're not pulling their weight or if they're not engaging. That really helped in the organization of the whole thing. And before they meet, actually, they draft together a preliminary peer review report. So on a shared document, they already start to collect major points, minor points, depending on how they decide as a group they want to work. Each group has a bit of a different dynamic, but they try to collect and bring together their peer review report draft under the guidance of the lead trainee. Then the small group meets on Zoom together with the editor-mentor. So the editor-mentor has seen the peer review report that they've drafted. Generally, especially for the first meeting, it's incredibly long and incredibly detailed, and the language could be improved. So in the sense of not necessarily English language, but just how the elements of the peer review report are conveyed. And that's something then that the editor mentor coaches them on during this 3-hour session. So they discuss, which points maybe should have more priority. They go back and they talk about specific methodological issues in the paper. Sometimes this takes a bit longer than 3 hours. Sometimes they need to follow up in a second call, but they really try to discuss all of the elements that are needed to bring this report together. In the end, the group and, of course, the editor-mentor signs off on the final review report, and that review report is then sent to the journal, and the BMJ, who we've partnered with so far, has an open review policy, so all of the reviewers, all of the trainees, and the editor-mentor, in our case, are named, so they're credited for the review. And then what's really exciting for the students is that they're looped into all of the communication. So they hear about what happens to the paper. They get to see what the other reviewers on the paper recommended. And then they also discuss that with the editor mentor. So usually then in later meetings, they follow up. So what actually happened to that paper? Oh, that's interesting. That reviewer also raised this point, or this reviewer didn't comment on anything regarding the methods. And that's usually what our groups tend to focus on. So that's quite an interesting exchange that follows from that. And then another nice feature, we've been fortunate to listen in to the BMJ editorial board meeting that takes place every week. And so we allow our students a one-time listen-in opportunity after they've done all the workshops. We listen in to a session and they will hear about how papers are discussed, how papers are either voted up or voted down by the editorial board. And then we spend some time afterward reflecting on this, what they've heard, maybe things that surprised them, the different roles in the editorial board meeting, different items that pop up that actually push a paper maybe to be accepted or not in the discussion, how that dynamic within the editorial board works, and importantly, how the peer review reports, which all of the editors have, contributed to that ultimate decision. So this is really a highlight that the students have reported they really enjoy. And then we spend some time wrapping up the course and getting feedback. We're trying to always improve the course and its content and its organization. So that's something we also do in the wrap-up session. So in total, quite a time commitment for both the participants and us, but I think over the time since we completed the pilot, we've gotten a lot more efficient in doing this. We've had a lot of lessons learned, and we've developed a lot of materials that we think work well and would allow someone else also to offer this course in a very compact and efficient way. So I'll talk more about that later, because for those of you who say, oh, this is great, could I do something like this at my university? Absolutely, and we're very interested in helping you do that. So where we are so far, we did a pilot. We are evaluating the course. We started with the evaluation in 2020. Then we tried to ramp up our reach and enroll additional students in the program. And now we're working on finalizing the study results and preparing this material for dissemination and hopefully securing some further funding for continued courses going forward. So I want to talk a little bit more about this course as a didactic vehicle to train EPI methods competencies, because it is a course that's focused on peer review. That's true, but I think peer review is a really unique opportunity to hone those EPI method skills. So as I mentioned earlier, the students, of course, will encounter designs that maybe they've had in their curriculum at some point, but probably have not had a lot of practice with. Or maybe designs that are entirely new to them and they really have to do some reading in order to be able to evaluate the methods and contribute to the discussion. So this is something that we've found incredibly interesting as sort of in the observer capacity during the workshop, how much EPI methods training is actually going on in the review of other scientific work. And of course, in the coursework, we're often reading papers with students and discussing them, but there's something about being accountable in that role of a peer reviewer, being the gatekeeper and helping inform the editor to make a decision on the paper. That gives you another level of accountability for those methods. You really want to understand them as best you can inside and out. And we've gotten a lot of positive feedback that way, that the participants and even the editor mentors are really going in, digging in deep into these methods and having methods-focused discussions. So I thought for the EPI methods lecture series here, this would be of great interest. And I think it's something, I mean, with more time, you could even spend more time on these items and maybe learn more than what many courses are able to transfer in terms of knowledge gain. So we wanted to evaluate some of the course elements in a scientific way. As I mentioned, the literature is quite sparse in terms of evaluation. We were limited in some aspects because we are running a course and we wanted our doctoral students to participate, so we were not about to randomize people to not participate in the course. So we used a pre-post method for the evaluation, which of course has some limitations. But our idea was to get at least some evidence out there, both in terms of quality assessment of the peer review reports that the students were able to create, and also in terms of the self-assessed knowledge and skills of peer review competencies that are relevant. So the first question was, does peer review report quality differ after the completion of our Peerspectives curriculum, which of course is a part of a semester of doctoral studies? We're not able to tease that apart with our pre-post design. We understand that among motivated doctoral students, and if so, to what extent? The second question was, how does the quality of these peer review reports that the students generate after the training program compare with those submitted by actual BMJ reviewers for those same manuscripts? So how well do they compare to the reviewers that the BMJ in our case is actually using? And to what extent do the self-assessed knowledge and relevant peer review competencies differ between the pre and post-course evaluations? So in total, after 4 runs of the course, and we're now working on subsequent runs, but we cut after 4 for the evaluation study. We enrolled a total of 80 students who gave consent to participate in the study, both in the quality assessment and the knowledge skills self-assessment. And we pre-registered the study on OSF. So here's just a little bit about the study sample. You can see most of our participants were quite early career researchers. Many of them had their highest degree in some sort of master training like epidemiology, biostatistics, public health, something like that. This is maybe a bit unique to the German system, but in the German system, a lot of folks are doing medicine and then complete a doctoral degree on top of the medical training. In German, we call this Dr. Med. So we had also some of these more medical focused students who had some additional epidemiology or statistics training who also took part in the course. The vast majority had never performed peer review in the past. Actually, many people also had never published anything before, if anything, maybe the first publication. And for those who did perform peer review in the past, the median number of papers was 2. So quite inexperienced peer reviewers, which is exactly where we wanted to pick them up. Before they had maybe developed some habits that would have to be retrained, we thought let's try to pick up these students before they've had much experience, if any at all. So how did this work? We asked participants for their informed consent. If they wanted to participate in the study linked to the course, they also could participate in the course without participating in the study, and a few people did not participate in the study. So for those who did give us their consent, everyone participating in the course also had to sign a confidentiality agreement with the BMJ so that they could also attend the editorial meetings. Then each semester, we got 4 manuscripts that were actual live under review manuscripts from the BMJ for the purposes of the scientific evaluation study. These were different than the manuscripts that were done by each of the groups in the workshops as a part of the course. These 4 manuscripts were just to assess the quality of the peer review reports. And what we asked the students to do was to draft a peer review report on their own for this manuscript under real world conditions. So we let them use any resources. They had 2 weeks to complete the task. They could request 1 week extension, and then we started chasing them, just like one of those manuscript submission systems would do. So we really made the conditions real world here. Then we assigned participants to get one of these manuscripts as a pre-course assessment and one as post-course. This was done with block randomization, and they submitted both the pre and the post-course assessments. Then we had collectively several pre-course assessments and post-course assessments for each manuscript. We stripped those manuscripts of the participant ID or any kind of identifying information, and whether or not it was pre or post as its time point. And then we gave these manuscripts to the handling editor who handled that manuscript at the BMJ, and 1 additional editor to score using this review quality index, review quality instrument, I believe. And this is something that's been used in the peer review literature. It's actually quite a simple scale: 1 for poor through 5 excellent. How would you rate the quality of this review overall? And so the editors then actually are in the process now of finalizing the scores on these manuscripts, and then we will have something to compare pre and post. As I mentioned, we also wanted to look at how the students' reports post-course compared with those of actual reviewers. And for this comparison, we're making use of the routinely collected RQI scores that the BMJ collects in a standard way from all of the peer reviews that they receive. So each handling editor scores the peer reviews they receive. That's why it has to be simple, because they do the scoring of every single peer review report they get. And we would like to make a comparison then on the manuscript level of how our students performed compared with the reviews that were received for a given manuscript. So we have to account for that clustering, of course, and this will be a non-inferiority. And this was also reflected in a lot of the text comments we got from participants in the evaluations, luckily hitting a lot of the points we were aiming for. So this course helped me to deepen my knowledge of critically reviewing a scientific manuscript, which will help me improve the quality of my own research papers in the future, and saying that it's one of the courses they benefited from the most with regard to future tasks in the field of research. And from our journal partner at the BMJ, they said the Peerspectives program has been valuable to the BMJ editors, and that they've really liked the reviews that they've received. We heard that they were often the strongest reviews. Of course, we had 5 people working on the reviews, so a bit unfair in the workshop comparison, but they were very happy also with the post-assessment reviews. I just want to end on this note here. So we received funding from the Spokes program, which was focused on funding early career initiatives to improve research culture and practice. And we published this consensus view as a part of this larger group in PLOS Biology. And I think it's very important that organizations empower early career researchers to be a part of the science improvement process. This was an incredible experience for us to create this program and to spread the word at our institution and beyond. And I think it also gave us a lot of inputs and motivation to further improve the quality of methods used in practice in the future. And I can only underscore the importance of this and funding this on an institutional level, but also beyond. It's very hard, as many of you know, to fund training initiatives, but such training initiatives really can have an impact on the quality of science and the quality of methods that are used and ultimately published. And of course, if we get early career folks involved in the review of these manuscripts who know about things like DAGs and causal inference that maybe epidemiologists trained 20, 30 years ago don't know as much about, maybe then we won't have this frustrating rejection simply for lack of knowledge. Okay, so I'll get off my soapbox there. What's next? We're working on tailoring the course to reach even more students from diverse backgrounds at different locations. We've seen a desire for an even deeper dive in the methods training, especially among the medical students. So coming up with a dedicated module to hone further some of these actually basic epi methods concepts for that target group. And as I mentioned, we're developing train the trainer materials that we'd like to release with the manuscript, hopefully once it's published, and share everything so that someone else could basically take the course in a box and unpack it and offer it in their setting. And hopefully finding more funding and become more sustainable into the future. So I just want to thank all of our partners, especially thank the BIH Quest Spokes Fellowship Program for allowing us to dedicate some of our research time to this task, to our whole team, Tobias Kurt, Teuvel Glatz, Nadia Wilk, Marco Piccinini, Hanne Grillmeier, Iman Abdikarim, Marianne Simoes, and Kerstin Rubart, the editors at the BMJ, Antoinette Maassen von den Brink, who brought in the sex and gender aspects into our curriculum, and all of these expert editor mentors who have donated their time to help train these early career scientists in peer review. I think they all agreed that it was a mutual learning experience, that they also got a lot of running the workshops, and we'd really welcome anyone who's interested in joining our team as an editor mentor in the future. Please get in touch. We'd be very happy to have some more experienced methods experts on board. Okay, that's it from my side. Thank you so much, and I'm happy to answer any questions you may have.